This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
So who's anyone here for the previous classes? Okay, so we pretty much got through everything. Now we're in what's called the bonus material section. So we talked a lot about the relationship between Israel and the Arab world and the metaphysical roots of the Middle East conflict. And we also did, the last class we did was on Zionism and Judaism. So I thought a great way of pulling it all together is to do a class which I call A Nation That Dwells Alone, which is basically why does the whole world pick on tiny Israel? And I'll explain the topic as we go, but I want to begin with a little background information. We talked about Zionism and the idea, if you read quotes from people like Herzl, what was very common in the thinking of early Zionism in the late 19th century was that the reason why there's anti-Semitism, by that point, think of what we lived through, everything, expulsions and blood libels and all this stuff. So the idea was that the real reason for anti-Semitism, since it seems to be so illogical, is we're the only nation without a national homeland. We have no one to protect us, no flag, no passport, no army, no ambassador. So a common kind of universally held belief of all early Zionist thinkers is that when we have those things, anti-Semitism will cease. Look at quote number 3. This is, again, Theodor Herzl, not the founder of Zionism, but certainly the most important person in making a Jewish state happen. He says, the Jewish question, he's saying this in 1896, the Jewish question still exists. It would be foolish to deny it. It exists wherever Jews live in perceptible numbers. It is a national question, which can only be solved by making it a political world question to be discussed and controlled by the nations of the civilized world in council. A wondrous generation of Jews will spring into existence. This is after a Jewish state is founded. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil and die peacefully in our own home. Now, Herzl died in 1904. And thank God we have a Jewish state. This Independence Day is going to be 70 years. But not only has the state of Israel not proven to be the solution to anti-Semitism, fast forward to the 21st century, the number one excuse for hating Jews in the world today is Israel Zionism. And we see it's a tremendous convergence of anti-Semitism, especially on university campuses with Zionism. And all Jews are somehow guilty of being Zionists, which is why Jewish students are often being abused or attacked on university campuses. And so we want to go into that phenomenon, like what is going on there? Like, why can't we have a state like anyone else? That was the whole Zionist dream, Liotam Chofshi B'Aratzenu, to be a free people in our own land. But also, like everything else in Jewish history, for better or for worse, we're like always sort of supernatural. Our history always seems to violate all the laws of human history. And even when it comes to Israel bashing and anti-Zionism, there are aspects of the phenomenon that are just like so stand outside the box kind of thing that it's really going to catch our attention. We got to ask the question, what is really going on here? Now, everything I'm going to show you now in this class, it's about 10 points of the unique way, the double standard that the world treats Israel as opposed to everyone else. I'm sure you've come across all of them at some point or another, but you've never seen them all together. When you see them all together, it's sort of overwhelming. If I were to just do the 10 points and leave, you'd need Prozac before you could walk out of the room because they're so depressing. But I'm not going to leave you depressed. Golda Meir said, pessimism is an emotion that Jewish people can never afford to have. So we're going to flip it over and try and pull out a positive, proactive message from the crazy double standard that Israel is being held to in the world, on the world stage. So pretty much every one of these points is going to begin with a statement: Israel is the only country in the world that. So you can follow along here. We're not going to read every quote here, but you can follow along here and look at where the big number 1 over here. Israel is the only country in the world whose national identity has been labeled racist and illegal. And a lot of these points are unique to the Jewish people in the world's treatment of the Jewish state that you don't see anywhere else in the world. What I'm specifically referring to, guys, is that famous UN General Assembly Resolution 3379, November 1975, where the General Assembly got together and declared Zionism an illegal racist ideology. And if you look at you can look at the whole resolution here. But if you look at the last line, it says, determines that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. You guys realize how bizarre that is? That a country's national identity should be called illegal is kind of unique in the world. It's like American is illegal. It's a racist ideology. The only thing more weird than this was miraculously, one of the few positive twists in the class, is that in December 1991, 15 years later, Israel was actually able to get enough votes in the General Assembly to overturn that resolution, which is almost impossible if you look at the General Assembly's voting record on the Jewish state. But that's point number 1. that we're the only country in human history declared by the UN to have our national identity, the notion of a Jewish state, declared illegal. Number two, Israel is the only country in the world whose very existence is threatened. I mean, specifically, we think of the Arab world by, and I should add on to this, it'll be a very long run-on sentence, threatened by another member state of the United, or multiple member states of the United Nations. Part of being a UN member state is you're not allowed to threaten other countries with, extermination. That's kind of the whole idea of the UN, is lambs lying down with lions, having soya barbecues, and no more war. So, but if you look at the Arab world and its reaction towards Israel, today when we think of countries threatening Israel, what do we think of? We think of Iran primarily, want to get a bomb. They even parade their they even parade their missiles. Thank God they don't have nuclear weapon yet. Soon, I'm sure. They even parade their missiles through the streets of Tehran with inscriptions about this one's for Israel, this is for Tel Aviv, that kind of thing. But it's not something new just with the relationship between Israel and Iran. This has been going on since the formation or pre-founding of a Jewish state in 1948. Look at Azam Pasha, Secretary General of the Arab League. This is the day after the War of Independence, May 14th, 1948. This is May 15th, 1948. This will be a war of extermination, a momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like a Mongolian massacre in the Crusades. Pretty hostile language. The next one I really like. I'm saying that sarcastically. This is columnist Ahmad Rajab from Al-Akhbar. Al-Akhbar is Egyptian press. Remember, Egypt is a country that's had a peace treaty with Israel since 1979, and their press is state-controlled. So the government is allowing this to be stated. This is a country we have a peace treaty with. Quote number 6. Thanks to Hitler of blessed memory, who on behalf of the Palestinians revenged in advance against the most vile criminals on the face of the earth. Although we do have a complaint against him, for his revenge on them was not enough. Whoa, unbelievable. But then you can see more recently, of course, that our big nemesis is Iran. You can see this is President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. He's no longer the president. They're now replaced by another Israel-loving Zionist president of Iran. But quote number 7, he says, know that this criminal and terrorist Zionist regime, which is years of plundering and aggression and crime to its name, has come to the end of its road and will soon be wiped off. The Zionist regime has reached a total dead end. With God's grace, your wish will soon be realized, and this germ of corruption will be wiped off. So you see, consistently, unique. There's a lot of conflicts going on in the world today. You don't have to go too far from here to see a civil war going on in Syria. But all these conflicts are internal struggles for power or ethnic cleansing wars, whatever, religious wars, Sunni, Shiite. There's only one country in the world whose very existence has been continually threatened since its inception, and the countries that threaten have never sanctioned it for doing it, which is Israel. And what should happen to Iran for threatening Israel's destruction? For sure, it should be sanctioned in the UN and really should be expelled from the United Nations, along with any country that threatens another country's existence. Yet it seems that to be openly hostile towards Israel in a world body that's supposed to be for peace is something that's acceptable. Again, it's a unique status that only Israel has. Okay, number 3 of the unique way the world treats Israel. Israel is the only country in the world whose capital city, which by the way is probably the oldest continuous capital of any people on the planet Earth, is not recognized by any other country in the world. That's pretty bizarre, by the way. Now, very few people have been around as long as we have in human history, but even people like the Chinese who have a pretty old history, their capitals moved, like Nanking to Beijing. We've never had it. Granted, we didn't have sovereignty over Jerusalem for 2,000 years, and some Jews think Brooklyn is the capital of the Jewish people, but we've never had another capital city besides Jerusalem. Yet, no country in the world recognizes Jerusalem as its capital city. By the way, how do you recognize a country as a country's capital as its capital? What do? You which? How do you? Where's the which? No, it's not. Where which? Where you set up your embassy, not your consulate, because the embassy is the home of the ambassador. Now, while there are many consulates, countries have multiple consulates, like France has multiple consulates in America, the ambassador only sits in Washington, D.C. So that's the bizarre part, that Israel's governmental bodies all sit in Jerusalem on the west side, which was never a part that was occupied illegally by Jordan and always part of Israeli territory since 1948. But the background to this whole little discussion goes back to 1980, when Israel passed the Basic Law. One of the statements made, it's sort of like a constitution, one of the statements made by Israel is that Jerusalem, remember, 1967, June 5th, beginning of the Six-Day War. We just had, a few months ago, the 50th anniversary celebration of Jerusalem reunified. But going back to the early 80s, the Knesset passed basically a statement saying that Jerusalem is the eternal, indivisible capital of the Jewish people, meaning it's never going to be divided again. We didn't have sovereignty for 2,000 years, and Jordan illegally occupied it for 19 years, but that's not up for discussion. By the way, that's a point which, across the spectrum of the Jewish world, even in the left in Israel, very few people advocate that Israel should redivide Jerusalem. So Israel did that unilaterally. Okay, it wasn't done with the sanction of the United Nations or any other world body. So how did the world react? You can look at quote number 8. This is UN Security Council Resolution 2245. Now, by the way, what's the difference between a Security Council resolution and a General Assembly resolution? First of all, Security Council is a much smaller body. It's a sub-body of the General Assembly, but there's one huge difference. Who knows? Who gets to sit on the Security Council, by the way? There's rotating members, but it's the victorious powers from World War II. You think that'd be a little obsolete by now, but that's how it still works, which means Japan or Germany can't sit in the Security Council. In theory, they could do it as rotating members, I believe. But anyway, what's the difference between a Security Council resolution and a General Assembly resolution? Dun, 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 dun. No one knows. General Assembly resolutions, thank God, are just pontificating, just a lot of air, statements, but have no backing in terms of international law or anything. Security Council resolutions are binding on all member states. Whichever is decided, any member state, all 190, I think 2 nations have to, by definition, as members of the UN, follow. So here's the world's reaction to Israel's unilateral claiming that Jerusalem is the permanent, indivisible capital of the state of Israel. And you could see, by the way, in quote 8, adopted by the Security Council on the 2245th meeting on August 20th, 14-0 with the U.S. abstaining. I mean, unanimous. So it goes on to say that, this is section number 5, the UN decides not to recognize the basic law and such other actions by Israel that as a result of this law seek to alter the character and status of Jerusalem and calls upon, here's the actual resolution, A, all member states to accept the decision, which means Jerusalem is not the capital, and B, those states that have established diplomatic missions at Jerusalem to withdraw such missions from the Holy City. By the way, prior to this resolution being passed, in 1980, only 13 countries had embassies in Jerusalem. A lot of countries don't have diplomatic relations with Israel, but where are all the embassies of countries that do have diplomatic relations? By 1996, no country in the world maintains an embassy in Jerusalem. Where are all the embassies? Go on Har Yakon Street on Tel Aviv, which is right along the beach, and you'll see embassy, 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 embassy. Guys, do you realize how outrageous this is? To tell a country that its capital is not its capital. I mean, you couldn't write it as fiction. We're not talking about Israel deciding to move the Knesset into East Jerusalem, the disputed areas, but that the areas that Israel had since 1948, not to recognize it as capital, unique. By the way, the most pro-Israel body in the world is what? Not the Israeli Knesset, by the way. There are members of the Israeli Knesset, like the Arab List, who any other country in the world would at best be in jail for sedition and arguably executed for treason. But what's the most pro-Israel body in the world? It's not the Knesset, it's the U.S. Congress. Believe me, there's more unanimity and support for Israel in the Congress and Senate than there is in the Knesset in Israel. So look at quote number 9. Jerusalem, sorry, yeah.
Does this, besides for just being in that state, does it actually make a difference? Like, if we really care just a...
Makes a big difference. The world doesn't recognize the status. A lot of people won't even come to Jerusalem, even the west side of Jerusalem. There's no ambassadors here. People don't want to show up in the city. It says about the legitimacy of...
Does it affect Israel in general?
No, it doesn't affect our day-to-day functioning, but it definitely has an impact on the perception of our right to be here. And look, the opposite is now taking place with the de-Judaizing of the Jewish presence in the land of Israel, which we'll touch on a little later. Look at quote 9. This is the Jerusalem Embassy Relocation Act, which was passed in 1995. Notice the vote, by the way, in the Senate, 93-5. You never get a Knesset vote going like that. Look in the Congress. It's 374-37. Which means both bodies voted over 90% for this. Look what it says. Be enacted by the Senate of the Representatives of the United States and Congress Assembly. The United States maintains its embassy in the functioning capital of every country except in the case of our democratic friend and strategic ally, the State of Israel. Look at Section 3. Timetable. The United States Embassy in Israel shall be established in Jerusalem no later than May 31st, 1999. Now, by the way, even Trump, when he ran for president this time, what was the promise he was always making? Going to move. I said he'll build a wall with Mexico way before the embassy's going to move. It's easier to do that kind of stuff, believe me. So every president, it's an act of Congress and the Senate, unanimously. How come it hasn't happened? Because every president since 1995, like Bush, everyone has used their executive power to block it, saying it's going to impede the ability to reach a Middle Eastern peace or threaten American strategic ability, American strategic interests and so forth. I could show you the land, by the way, that's set aside for the U.S. Embassy, but who knows if it's ever going to be built there. But guys, this is a unique thing. The only country in the world whose capital is not recognized by any other country. Crazy stuff. Number 4, Israel is the only country in the world that is expected to and has given its holiest site to another religion, which, by the way, in parentheses it says, now claims that it never was a Jewish holy site. Now, first of all, we got to clarify what's the holiest spot in the world for the Jews. Some Jews think it's a buffet table. Some Jews think it's the Western Wall. By the way, go read Yossi Klein Halevi's book, Like Dreamers, about the paratroopers who liberated the wall, and you'll see that on the morning of June 7th, when Jerusalem was finally conquered by the paratroopers, they get first on. They come from the Lion's Gate on the east side of the city. They get onto the Temple Mount first. They're running around the Temple Mount asking where the Western Wall is, which is like having a beautiful Mercedes blow up, or the Jaguar, it has that little Jaguar emblem. Your car gets blown to smithereens, and all you're worried about is where's the little hood ornament. Where's the holiest spot in the world for the Jewish people? Where is the holiest spot? Not the Western Wall. Western Wall has no intrinsic holiness. It's only because we pray there. Sorry? Temple Mount. Underneath, right, the gold dome is in Jewish tradition the place where we say, what happened? Where's the first mention of it as a holy spot for the Jews? The binding of Isaac, the Akedah, Genesis chapter 22. When God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son, whom you love, offer him up and he brings him there. People always ask me, why there? I always give the same answer. Ask God. But for whatever reason, in Jewish consciousness, we understand that's the ultimate high-speed spiritual download site, the ultimate, for Wi-Fi, hotspot for spirituality. The place you can naturally connect where the physical and the metaphysical meet is there. And therefore, the logical place to build what is the holiest object in the world for the Jewish people? The temple. And 2 temples stood on that spot. First temple for 410 years, destroyed by the Babylonians, 70-year exile. Second temple, 420 years, destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, and we haven't had it back quite yet, although I'm always hoping to look out the window when the class is over and see it standing there. But guys, the point is, we're Jerusalem obsessed. It's mentioned 667 times in the Bible, Jerusalem. Everywhere in the world, we're praying towards Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, we're praying towards the Temple Mount. We're crazy about that spot. So, but for 2,000 years, we never had it under Jewish control. And by the way, it's intrinsically holy. Whether there's a Jewish country, whether there's Jewish control of Jerusalem, whether there's a temple there, that is the place. So we're obsessed with the spot. And then in 1967, we get control of the spot. What do? Israel does something unprecedented. What do? We go and give it to the Muslim Religious Trust, the Waqf. By the way, never in the history of Islam did the Waqf ever have control of the site. And imagine that. Imagine the Pope coming out and meeting the chief rabbi of Rome and saying, you know what? You guys are pretty cool. We want to be nice. Here's the keys to the Vatican. Have fun on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. You can stick a lot of Jews in St. Peter's, We'd be like, are you crazy? Okay, the Pope's already wearing a kippah. Maybe that explains it. But the Arab world not only doesn't say, wow, you Jews are unbelievable. Now what do they say? It never was a Jewish holy spot. And this is only getting worse. This has accelerated in the last year, much worse. Look at quote number 10. This is from Sheikh Tasser Rajab Tamima, who's the PA chief Islamic judge. He's like the chief rabbinic authority. He used to be up there. He says, Jerusalem is an Arab and Islamic city and has always been so. Excavation work conducted by Israel since 1967 have failed to prove that Jews had a history or a presence in Jerusalem or that their ostensible temple had ever existed. And I could show you quote after quote of Palestinian archaeologists, etc., saying that 100 years of digging in Jerusalem has never unearthed one piece of archaeology to connect the Jewish people to the land of Israel, Jerusalem. It's unbelievable. I could take you to a museum and show you literally tens of thousands of artifacts that clearly connect the Jewish people to the land of Israel and Jerusalem. Yeah. For which? Why did Israel do it?
Yeah, I'm sure that there were people on the land, right?
You're talking about 1967? Yeah, 1967, by the way, the paratroopers popped open the little trapdoor in the gold dome and hung an Israeli flag out there. Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Defense, went berserk and said, you take that down, the Arab world's going to go nuts. By the way, 67, the Arab world wouldn't have done anything. We could have removed the building and they would have been upset, but they wouldn't have done a thing. They were so scared of Israel. But how comes, you know why? Because like Eric Hoffer said, the American sociologist, he said Jews are the only people who are actually expected to act like Christians. So we have to turn the other cheek. Who knows? I don't want to go into the thinking of the Israeli government, why they did it. But guys, it is absolutely crazy what's gone on. It's like literally, I'm not exaggerating, the Pope giving, or the great mosque in Mecca being given over to the Catholic Church. By the way, you can't even go into Mecca unless you're a Muslim. Forget the time. You know, the best way to, and by the way, the only people allowed to pray on the holiest spot in the world for Jews are Muslims. Jews are not allowed to pray up there. If you go up there as a Jew today, and you're identified as a Jew, the police will follow you. They're checking everything, no prayer book. If they catch you trying to pray, they will arrest you and throw you in jail. I know multiple people it's happened to. You couldn't write this as fiction, guys. But that's what's going on. And by the way, it's only gotten much worse. UNESCO, my favorite organization, I'm being sarcastic, passed a resolution today completely denying any Jewish connection to the Temple Mount. Everything, not today, but now, like within the last year. UNESCO, that's the United Nations Cultural Heritage sub-organization of the UN. They said they said while Jerusalem is holy to the three great monotheistic faiths, any reference to a temple or a Jewish presence in Jerusalem is completely obliterated. Everything is El Aqsa Mosque, and everything is referred to in using the Islamic names. Okay, guys, we got to keep going, but it's stuff you couldn't write as fiction. Okay. Number 5. Israel is the most criticized nation in the world and the only liberal democratic country in the world consistently singled out for criticism and condemnation. And this has been going on and only getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. Some of this stuff is a little bit dated, but the new statistics are also crazy, and I have them in my head, so I'll tell you them. Look at quote number 11. This is the Contemporary Global Anti-Semitism report released by the State Department. It says between 2001 and 2006, the UN General Assembly's plenary and main committees, not including the former Commission on Human Rights Council, adopted over 120 human rights-related resolutions focused on Israel, with more anticipated by the end of 2007-2008. During the same period, only 10 resolutions were adopted in these same bodies regarding the situation in North Korea, Burma, and Sudan. By the way, who sits on the Human Rights Council? It's ridiculous. Countries like Saudi Arabia, like this. It's amazing. Some of the biggest human rights violators in the world. It's like putting Adolf Hitler on the Jewish Pride Committee. Lest you think this is something dated and out of fashion, in 2016, last year, the UN passed 26 condemnations. 20 against Israel and 6 for the entire rest of the world. Like Syrian civil war, 800,000 people dead, the majority of the population now displaced, gets like a resolution. Barely. Look at the chart here, guys. You can see. Total resolutions UN. You can see that the condemnations against Israel far exceed in the last 40 years the collective condemnations against every other country in the world combined. Given that we're the only liberal democratic country in the entire Middle East with free market economy, free press, free speech, tolerance, gay rights, you name the whole thing. One thing's for sure, guys, the Pride Parade is never going to be held in Gaza. Okay, so the standard is insane, and it doesn't get better. It consistently stays at this level. Even the new Human Rights Committee, which was made because the other one was too anti-Israel, is just as bad as the old committee. Look at number 6. Israel is the only country in the world that is attacked and then is condemned for responding, that shows greater restraint in response to attacks than any other country, yet is condemned constantly for using excessive force, and that is expected to return 100% of its territory that it won after being attacked. Basically, in simple English, by the way, Israel is the only country in the world that is not allowed to defend itself, and when it wins wars for its survival that it didn't start, it is treated like the aggressor that lost the war. Again, totally unique way the world treats Israel. And this is an example from like the 2006 war in the last big Lebanese war in 2006. You remember that one? 1982. The PLO went into Lebanon and destabilized it in the mid-1970s, the Palestinian. Israel went in 1982 because they were launching Katyusha rockets into Israel. Israel got stuck there until the year 2000 basically with a buffer zone controlled by the South Lebanese Christian Phalange Army. In the year 2000, Ehud Barak removed the Israeli military presence. The South Lebanese army collapsed within a day, and Hezbollah, which makes the PLO look like kindergarten, took over. And they started hostilities on the border. Remember in 2006, what did they do? They ambushed some Israeli reservists in 2 Hummers. They fired a rocket into the first one on the border, killing all the soldiers. They fired a rocket into the second one. Apparently, they took 2 soldiers' bodies. They may have been dead already. They certainly died later. They dragged them across the border. By the way, if you shoot across a border and kill another country's soldiers, what is that considered in international law? It's called casus belli, an act of war. Then, to cover the retreat of the Hezbollah guys back across the border, they unleashed a massive artillery barrage on all of northern Israel. Definitely an act of war. Israel went in a very poorly orchestrated 1-month-long war, which, whatever, I don't get into the history of how badly that was done. Didn't lose the war, but it didn't win the way it should have. But look at the world's reaction to Israel. It's like unbelievable. Here's the United Nations, quote number 12. Jan Englund, he's still around doing damage, this guy. A top United Nations humanitarian official said that Israel's response is a violation of international law. I mean, defending yourself is violating law. He was equally critical of Hezbollah and Hamas for abducting Israeli soldiers. He also said that, listen, look at this. Those who seized Israeli soldiers and fired rockets into Israel from South Lebanon bore their share of the blame. You see the wording of this, guys? It's crazy. It's like making the U.S. partially responsible for the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. They're completely responsible, bore their share. Look at Amnesty International. I call them Amnesia International. It says, this report also states that Israel, to preserve the principle of proportionality, even if the destroyed objects could serve as dual purpose. It called on independent and impartial inquiry appointed by the UN. That's called an oxymoron. 2 words don't go together, independent, impartial, UN. To investigate alleged war crimes by both Hezbollah and Israel. You guys get the thing underlined here, proportionality? Proportionality is a term only used with Israel. You guys realize in the Middle East today it's called asymmetrical warfare? What's asymmetrical warfare? It's when a nation state fights a war with a non-nation state with the weapons being unequal. Like, what's another example of great asymmetrical? 2 great asymmetrical combats take place in the Middle East outside of Israel recently. U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. The U.S., the largest military in the world, fighting the Taliban. What was the Amnesty International saying? That Israel is using disproportionate force. And we'll see with the European Union. Look what the European Union says in the next quote. European Union is greatly concerned. That's what Europeans get nowadays. They get greatly concerned about the disproportionate use of force by Israel and Lebanon in response to attacks by Hezbollah and Israel. The presidency deplores the loss of civilian lives and destruction of civilian infrastructure. The imposition of an air and sea blockade on Lebanon cannot be justified. Meaning the other side deliberately puts its missiles where? Firing from schools, from UN buildings, stuff like that. So they're the ones who are committing the war crime by using a human shield. Israel excruciatingly tries to pinpoint the attacks and minimize but Israel's attacked for doing that. Guys, the whole thing is crazy, but what comes out of this, which is unique, is not only is Israel not allowed to defend itself, Israel's not allowed to use disproportionate force, which means since Hezbollah doesn't have an air force, Israel shouldn't be using its air force. You ever heard of such a thing? Like saying to the Taliban, you guys only have like rocket-propelled, shoulder-fired missiles and Kalashnikovs. So the U.S. Army is not allowed to use any of its air force or helicopters or tanks or artillery because it's not fair. That's basically what they're saying. The whole thing is absolutely insane. And you can't impose a blockade on a country you're fighting a war with. You have to let their supplies flow in freely so they can rearm their troops on the front line. These are standards that are only used against Israel. Guys, go down to the chart below. This is the first Gaza War. My oldest son fought in this war. By the way, just the background to that war is that in 2005, Arik Sharon, it caused the breakup of the Likud party, did a deal where he destroyed all the Jewish communities in Gaza, threw the Jews out. And you remember this? That was unbelievable. There was dozens of Jewish communities in Gaza. He basically forcibly removed the Jews. It was the worst thing I ever saw on television in Israel. Soldiers dragging Jews out of their homes, Jewish soldiers, with the soldiers crying at the same time as the civilians are crying. That was the most painful thing I've seen in my entire life in this country. And probably period. In 2005, it caused the government to fall apart, everything. And anyway, we're going to give it over to the Palestinian Authority. What happened immediately after? A civil war broke out in Gaza. Hamas took over, killed and expelled all the PLO guys, and then started firing missiles into Israel. Israel ended its occupation of Gaza. If you fire missiles into someone's territory, by law, it's a violation of international law. It's a war crime. Look, you see the chart. How many missiles were fired? Israel then went in to stop their civilians from being, all of the area around Gaza was bomb shelters and people suffering from PTSD, and it was horrible. Israel went in with great care, by the way, dropping leaflets on buildings before. Israel's the only country in the world that sends text messages into the enemy. We're going to blow up your building because we don't want civilians to be killed. Look at the useless nations, the UN Human Rights Council resolution. This is unbelievable. 2009. Recognizing also that Israeli siege imposed upon occupied Gaza Strip. It wasn't occupied anymore. Israel left. Including the closure of border crossings leads to disastrous humanitarian, economic, and environmental consequences. Strongly condemns Israel military attacks and operations in the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly ones in the occupied Gaza Strip. How many times can you say occupied in one sentence? Which have resulted in the killing and injuring of thousands of Palestinian civilians. This is not true, by the way. Including a large number of women and children. Not true. And also condemns, look at this one, guys. Pay attention. Also condemns the firing of crude rockets on Israeli civilians. Demands that the occupying power stop targeting civilians. What's that? You look at the word crude. What is that indicating? I've heard European Union members say that the Palestinians have firecrackers. You ever see what a Katyusha rocket does when it hits a building? Okay, it's the whole thing. By the way, during the last Gaza War in 2014, a member of the European Union demanded that Israel share its Iron Dome missile system with Hamas. Now, you guys remember having that war? The only reason why life went on here is normal because Israel invented this amazing missile system that could shoot down. By the way, each of those missiles cost how much money? $40,000 a piece. How much does a Katyusha rocket cost? It's like $50, $100. You know, so we protect our citizens. They cynically use them as human shields. Again, all of this is disregarded. By the way, the only person who came out, to be fair, in 2009 after the first Gaza War is Richard Kemp, former NATO commander in Bosnia, one of the heroes of this all. He testified in front of the Goldstone Committee. Look what he writes in quote 14. He says, based on my knowledge and experience, I can say this. During the Operation Cast Lead, that was the war, the Israeli Defense Forces did more to safeguard the rights of civilians in a combat zone than any other army in the history of warfare. So what he's saying is Israel behaves with more control, self-restraint, and control, minimizing civilian casualties, yet no country is condemned and bashed for defending itself the way Israel is. Look at number 7. Israel is the only country and arms to an enemy in times of war. By the way, Gaza, which is always short on electricity, Israel sends electricity directly into Gaza. They literally owe billions of shekels, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, to the Israel Electric Corporation, which they never pay, by the way. I don't pay my electric bill for a week. I get this threatening turn-off notice. We're going to cut you off. But during the actual war, Hamas, by the way, had a great thing with Ishmael Haniyeh, the head of Hamas. They're sitting in a room. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They close the blinds. They light candles, and they have an emergency. This is a Hamas emergency meeting. There's no power in Gaza. Now, all the journalists photographing know this was filmed in broad daylight with the curtains closed. And then the world's screaming, look at the children are dying in hospitals because Israel's cut off the power. Unbelievable stuff, guys. Look at. Yeah, well, Israel does all. Israel has treated hundreds and hundreds of Syrian victims of the civil war. So look at Richard Kemp once more in quote 16. He said, during the conflict, the IDF allowed huge amounts of humanitarian aid into Gaza. To deliver aid virtually into the enemy's hands is, to a military tactician, normally quite unthinkable, but the IDF took on those risks. So no country behaves with more restraint and humanity in war than Israel. Go watch what goes on now. Like the Americans accidentally bomb a building and kill 45 civilians. You see it happens in the Syrian civil war. Can you imagine if Israel, like today, accidentally hit a building trying to take out some Hamas target and killed 15 civilians? There'd be an emergency Security Council resolution. The world would be screaming. All the leftists on campus would be having, apoplexy over Zionist violence, and unbelievable. Okay, number 8. Israel is the only country in the world that is expected to eject and actually ejects its own citizens from homes and destroys communities that it built. That's the example of what happened in Gaza in 2005. No other country does that kind of stuff. Number 9, we're going to run through quick because we're running out of time. Israel bashing is the only country in the world that is the only conflict in the world that will unite movements and ideologies that are fiercely opposed to each other and are natural enemies. And this is great. That the only situation I've seen a body-pierced gay activist in a room with a radical jihadi Muslim with the gay activist guy wearing a keffiyeh around his neck. What would normally happen to a radical gay body-pierced activist in a place like Tehran? He'd be hung from a crane. Literally, they hang them from cranes. Yet, what's the only cause that'll get them in a room together at the same time, yelling and screaming? We hate Israel. By the way, there's an organization called Queers for Palestine, which accuses Israel of pinkwashing. By the way, Tel Aviv is rated as one of the top 2 or 3 most gay-friendly cities in the world. So Queers for Palestine says Israel hides behind its tolerance of the LGBT community to mask its genocidal policies against the Palestinians. Stop pinkwashing. Give me a break. This is crazy stuff. Look at this as an all UK, United Kingdom parliamentary inquiry into anti-Semitism, quote number 18. The most worrying discovery of this inquiry is that anti-Jewish sentiment is entering the mainstream, appearing in everyday conversations to people who consider themselves neither racist nor prejudiced. Go down to number 19. This is the same. This is very interesting what he's saying now, and this is so relevant to the Euro left today, and even the left in America. The left in particular sees itself as immune from anti-Semitism, which it considers the exclusive provenance of the xenophobic right. Commitment to Palestinian independence comes not from anti-Jewish prejudice, but from a sense of justice and the need to redress grievances in what is increasingly seen as unfinished post-colonial business. So that you see this exactly today. It's called the Red-Green Alliance, the alliance between the extreme left in the United States and in Europe and radical Muslims. And the issue they unite on is Israel bashing. Number 10, last but not least, and then we got to go put it all together. Jews are the only people in the world who are considered co-responsible for what their co-religionists do. Meaning what happens in Israel spills over into the rest of the world. Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin wrote a great book called Why the Jews. They write in their book in quote 20, anti-Zionism is unique in only one way. Meaning in terms of other forms of anti-Semitism throughout history, it's the only form of Jew hatred to deny that it hates Jews. But look at the U.S. State Department's report in 2006. Frequently, no distinction is made between Zionists and Jews regarding whether or not the Jews are Israeli or whether or not the Jews support the policies of Israel. The two terms are often used interchangeably. Such anti-Zionist discourse often employs classic demonic stereotypes of Jews. And this is what you see going on in the world today. For instance, when are the spikes? Anti-Semitism, which is going up and up and up and up and up in Europe especially, when does it spike? When do you get huge spikes? When what's going on in Israel? A war. Both Gaza wars, both war in Lebanon, massive. You guys don't even remember. It's not that long ago. In 2014, there was scenes in Paris of Muslims trying to storm synagogues to kill the Jewish worshippers inside. With, of course, the French police not showing up because that's what the French police do best. They probably showed up and surrendered. But the French advertised their surplus World War II rifles, dropped once, never fired. No, thank God Jewish Defense League showed up and fought the Arabs off. But what does a Jew in Paris have to do with what's going on in Israel? But that's one of the aspects of anti-Semitism when it may be focusing in Israel today, the world's attention, but it spills over. Look at this cartoon. This is not an Arab cartoon. This is what the State Department was talking about. The intermingling of Israeli images, the IDF soldier here in his IDF uniform with his gun. What's he wearing on his head? A talit. A talit. What's a talit? It's a religious symbol. And what's the sickest part of all this, guys? That they're turning the 6 lines of a Magen David into a swastika. Is there anything sicker? Is there anything sicker? It's like putting a Ku Klux Klan hood on Barack Obama. I mean, it's anything more antithetical to one side than the other. But why is that being done? We'll get to that in just a minute. But look at the conclusion that the European Union comes to. I hope it didn't spend a lot of money to figure this one out. Quote 23. There seems to be some evidence to support the view that there is some link between the number of reported anti-Semitic incidents and the political situation in the Middle East. Duh. Of course there is. There's a direct link between spikes anti-Semitism and what goes on in Israel. And last but not least, before we put it all together, I just want to look at this quote from Prager and Telushkin in their Why the Jews book, which they came out with a new edition not so long ago. He said, quote 24, "This is the most frightening time for Jews since the Holocaust. From the Jews' perspective, the world can be divided into 3 kinds of countries. Those that hate Jews and want them dead, those that ignore this hatred and aid the haters, and America. Just one generation after nearly 7 out of 10 Jews of Europe were murdered, the remnant of Jews in the Jersey-sized Jewish state is threatened with annihilation. As in 1938, the world seems to be divided between those nations that were about to murder Jews and those that would let it happen." Might be a slight exaggeration. When Stephen Harper was Prime Minister of Canada, it wasn't so bad. But the level of insanity of attacks against Jews has reached levels that is mind-blowing. Just to throw in, before we come to a conclusion, I want to just read to you a headline from January 5th, 2011, just to show you that nothing has changed in the world since the medieval times. Here's a Jerusalem Post headline. Saudis hauled vulture for being Mossad's spy. This is not April Fool's. The Saudi Arabians are holding a vulture. You know a vulture, the bird? for being a Mossad spy. Listen to this. Saudi media reported on Tuesday that a vulture tagged with the words Tel Aviv University had been detained for being a Mossad spy. A report in the Saudi paper Al-Wiyam claimed that the vulture bearing a leg bracelet that transmitted with it, and a transmitter apparently placed by Israeli bird scientists to study migration patterns had been found in a rural area of the country. The paper said the flight appeared to be, quote, a Zionist plot. The report triggered a plethora of posts on Arabic websites claiming that, quote, Zionists had trained birds for espionage. The South Sinai governor last month suggested that a shark that killed a tourist in Sharm el-Sheikh had been intentionally released by the Mossad to sabotage tourism in the area. That's like saying Jews kidnap Christian babies' blood to use it to make matzah. Guys, if I stop the class now, you just need Prozac. You'd be so depressed. No, seriously. But I'm not going to. I want to flip it over because every cloud in Jewish history and Israel history has a silver lining, and this for sure. This stuff is way, way, way too weird. Okay, it's really supernatural. You see it all together, and you see that no other country is treated this way in the world. No, and so unfairly, and so disproportionately, and like the world seems to have gone nuts when it comes to treating Israel in a certain way. And when you see weird and supernatural together, what does that tell you? When you see something so weird, it's not normal. It's not natural. This is something much deeper going on. It seems to violate all the laws of what's going on in the norm of international relations between countries. Guys, what I wanted to say is, bottom line is that Israel bashing is, all excuses aside, the final form that anti-Semitism is taking in modern history. It's taken many forms, all of them irrational, and this is just as irrational as all the other ones. But to understand what's really going on, what do we learn from this? Sure, we got to defend Israel. You got AIPAC. You guys know AIPAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee. You got to write your congressman. You got to stand up for organizations like Stand With Us on campus. But that is merely putting symptoms on a deeper problem. And think about it. Where's the world holding today? Why have a convergence of 6 lines of a Star of David with turning it into a swastika? What's the message that's not too subtle going on there? Think about it. What's the message? No, why connect Jews to Nazis? You know, I have this theory, guys. I have this theory that the world doesn't know how to live with Jews as victors. It prefers us as victims. Okay, and there's almost a mathematical algorithm for how many Jews are killed versus how much sympathy we get in the world. Like Sparrow Pizza bombing in 2001, horrible bombing. 17 people killed, 150 wounded. Israel gets 2 days to defend itself against Palestinian terrorists, and then it becomes a disproportionate over-response, and Israel has to stop. I firmly believe it took 6 million Jews dying in the Holocaust. And if there's any silver lining to the Holocaust, what is it? What's the silver lining? You know the expression silver lining? Israel. I'm very clear in my mind. It took 6 million Jews dying for the world to feel sorry enough for the Jewish people to vote barely 33 to 13 with 10 abstentions, November 29, 1947, to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. Fast forward 70 years later. I heard a great quote. It's so true. It sounds. Germany has never forgiven the Jews for the Holocaust. Yeah, think about that. There's a whole class in there. 70 years later, they're like, we are sick of feeling guilty about that. We only gave you a state because what the Nazis did to you. If we turn you, into the Nazis, whatever, that's the convergence, then we don't have to feel guilty anymore. So we can now stop backing you, and we can undermine and undo the mistake we made. Does anyone think I'm exaggerating here? I think that's pretty much it. Guys, that's a pretty depressing thought. But if we step back a little further and recognize that it has to do with the same thing, the world's inability to deal with the Jewish people and the Jewish state, and then we recognize what the real solution is here. While we do have to support pro-Israel organizations and fight the anti-Israel bias in the world, we got to recognize that what ultimately drives anti-Semitism has nothing to do with Israel's treatment of the Palestinians or Jews kidnapping Christian babies and poisoning wells 1,000 years ago. We have been dragging the world, kicking and screaming for 3,000 years plus towards a vision of values based on the idea of one God. And anti-Semitism, whatever excuse it hides behind, is always a rebellion against the national historic mission of the Jewish people to bring certain values and a vision of what the world's supposed to be like into human consciousness. Look at quote 27, last quote. This is Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin again, giving a beautiful summary of what really causes all Jew hate. This is what you want to take with you. It says, From its earliest days, the raison d'etre of Judaism, the reason for being of Judaism has been to change the world for the better. This attempt to change the world, to challenge the gods, religious or secular, of societies around them, and to make moral demands upon others has constantly been a source of tension between Jews and non-Jews. We now understand why so many non-Jews have regarded the mere existence of Jews, no matter how few, as terribly threatening. The mere existence of Jews, with their different values and allegiances, constitute a threat to the prevailing order. That's individual Jews, guys, but how much more so the Jewish state? Because if anything embodies the collectiveness of the Jewish people, it's the state of Israel. And whereas the founding fathers of Zionism just wanted to be like everyone else, like I said at the beginning, we just want to have a state like everyone else and sit in cafes in Tel Aviv and drink espresso and talk about movies and the arts. Guys, I'm going to make one prediction. I always say I'm not a prophet. If I was, I'd be working in Wall Street. But the one prediction I'm going to make is not something I thought up. It's said over and over again. It's most beautifully said, by the way, in the book of Numbers, chapter 23, verse number 9, said by Bilam, the famous non-Jewish prophet, who was hired to curse us, and out of his mouth comes a lot of blessings, and also one of the great truisms of being Jewish. He says, we're a nation that dwells alone, is not reckoned amongst the nations. Am shishkan levado. Guys, we will never be allowed to be like anyone else. It's not been our destiny. Not as individual Jews, and certainly not as a Jewish state. I always say being Jewish might not be comfortable, but it's always meaningful. On a very deep level, humanity is aware that you Jews and you Jewish state, you answer to a different drummer. You got a different responsibility in this world. You're never going to be allowed to just do what everyone else does. That was always the dream, like I mentioned in the last class, of Shimon Peres's New Middle East. Of, no high-speed trains running from Jerusalem to Damascus, and, a unified currency and the same, and like an EU kind of passport. It may eventually happen, guys, but only in the Messianic era. Certainly not before that. Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, he said it the best, and he's the founder of the Volozhin Yeshiva in the early 19th century. He said, when Jews don't make Kiddush, Gentiles make Havdalah. That's a great statement, by the way. That's the most simple, one-sentence explanation of anti-Semitism ever said. When Jews don't make Kiddush, Gentiles make Havdalah. You all know what Kiddush and Havdalah are? Doesn't mean literally. Kiddush is the ceremony we make on Friday night when we over wine, when we go into a higher elevated spiritual state of Shabbat. Havdalah is a ceremony you make on Saturday night, also on wine, when the world goes down to a lower state. Our job in the world, guys, the Jewish people and the Jewish state, is to do Kiddush Hashem. Not to learn Torah and do mitzvahs, by the way. It's a means to an end. It's not to serve God. It's only a figure of speech. He's infinite. The individual and collective responsibility of the Jewish people is to live and act in a way that inspires the world. Remember in physics, the expression, nature abhors a vacuum? You ever heard that expression? Vacuums don't like to exist. They'll always be filled with something. Guys, the world will either be filled with the values that we bring into the world via our individual Jewish identity and the state of Israel, or the world will be full of the opposite values. The opposite values are evil, and when evil comes into the world, it's going to target us first. Guys, it's not an accident that you can literally tell how countries are doing internally by how they treat their Jews. We're the canary in the coal mine. When evil comes into the world in a country, it comes after Jews first. Then it spreads to everyone else. And it's not an accident, like George Gilder says in his book, The Israel Test, that Israel is the Jew amongst the nations. Show me what a country thinks about Israel, and I'll tell you where that country's holding in terms of its morality. So that's a little bit scary, given the state of the world today, but it's also very empowering, because now we recognize what we really have to focus on. Stopping the Israel bashing is like a guy with a disease inside his body who has little, really serious disease, but he has sores on his skin. So you go to the pharmacy and you get some cream for the sores. That's the anti-Israel. That's the pro-Israel stuff that we do in the world today. The real disease, guys, is what's inside, the anti-Semitism, what really drives it, and the Jewish values. That's what we got to focus on, creating a Jewish state that is a light to nations and not just to be like anyone else. Like it says in the words of Hatikva. Beautiful song, and Neftali Hertz Ingbar, he says, Liotam Chofshi B'Artzeinu. We want to be a free people in our land. We need to change one word in Hatikva, Liotam Kadosh. To be a holy people, to be a people who has a state that's not like everyone else, to recognize we have a unique destiny in the world, to come together and stop fighting amongst each other. You see what's going on in Israel, guys? There are so much infighting here between the religious and the secular and the ultra-Orthodox and that. Guys, you notice in Auschwitz there weren't different lines for different kinds of Jews? There wasn't a line for Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Ultra-Orthodox. Our enemies all look at us as what? We're Jews. And our mind, we have to look at us as Jews. And trust me, guys, there's one pattern I've seen over and over again. When we fight a lot in this country and start arguing like you're seeing now, which just happened in, where was it? And I just heard in, down south, there was like religious secular violence yesterday or something, or you have the stuff going on at the Western Wall. God, the Father's looking down on us. He says, you guys want to fight my children? You want to kill each other? I can't stand it. I can't stand to watch. I'm going to send the non-Jews to do it for me. So guys, we got to recognize that bottom line is that the real focus of the Jewish people as we approach Rosh Hashanah and Elul is to work first and foremost on Jewish unity and proactivity and recognizing our unique destiny, and that being Jewish might not be comfortable, but it's meaningful. We got to create a nation that's a light to nations. And when we finally get a Jewish state that truly represents Jewish values, which, by the way, it already does to a large extent, the fact that Israel is what it is in the worst neighborhood in the world with all the inhumanity and human rights violations is already a testament to the Jewish people. Imagine how much more so it would be if we actually focused on making that way. So let's hope we see as we approach Rosh Hashanah that we have Jews for Judaism and a Jewish state that represents Jewish values. And then we get an end to Israel bashing and an end to anti-Semitism. We get peace for us and for the whole world. And we should have it soon. And in our days, Shana Tova, everyone. Have a good year. I will be back. However, I'm not saying goodbye to you guys. I'll be back on Thursday.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.